I lost my dream job because of my family's lies, but I fought back to reclaim my life. Hey Reddit, I'm Aiden, 28, and I've always been the black sheep of my family. While I've tried my best to make something of myself, my family's toxic behavior has constantly dragged me down. Recently, I landed my dream job at a top tech company, a high-paying position that felt like the culmination of all my hard work and sacrifices. But just when I thought my life was finally coming together, everything fell apart. Thanks to false rumors spread by my own family, I lost the job that meant everything to me. Here's the story of how my family's lies almost destroyed my life and how I'm fighting to rebuild. Growing up, my family life was always a bit of a mess. My parents, Ellen and Mark, were perpetually unhappy with their lives, always struggling to make ends meet and constantly blaming their problems on everyone else. My mom, Ellen, was overbearing and manipulative, while my dad, Mark, was passive and often went along with whatever she said just to keep the peace. It didn't take long for this toxic dynamic to bleed into their parenting. My older brother, Jason, 30, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. He was the star athlete in high school, the one my parents bragged about to anyone who would listen. But behind closed doors, Jason was entitled, arrogant, and quick to manipulate situations to his advantage. I, on the other hand, was the quieter, more introverted one who kept to himself and did well in school. But no matter what I achieved, it was never enough to measure up to Jason in my parents' eyes. Our household was filled with constant drama. Arguments would erupt over the smallest things, with my mom often pitting Jason and me against each other to maintain control. She'd praise Jason for even his smallest accomplishments while belittling me for not being as driven or as charismatic as my brother. My dad rarely intervened, always opting to sit on the sidelines, avoiding confrontation at all costs. It felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to avoid setting off the next explosion. One of my earliest memories of this toxic family dynamic was when I won my first academic award in elementary school. I was so excited, eager to show my parents the certificate I'd received for top grades in my class. I remember running home, holding the certificate with pride, only to be met with indifference. My mom glanced at it briefly before saying, "That's nice, Aiden, but Jason just got MVP in his football game." Isn't that amazing? It was like every moment that was supposed to be mine was overshadowed by Jason's accomplishments, even when they had nothing to do with mine. I remember the day I got accepted into a prestigious summer camp for coding, something I'd been passionate about since middle school. I'd saved up my allowance, participated in extra classes, and worked my tail off to secure a spot. When I showed my parents the acceptance letter, my mom barely looked at it. "Jason got invited to a basketball camp too," she said dismissively. Jason, who had no interest in going, made a big show of tearing up the invite, claiming it was a waste of his time. The message was clear: no matter what I did, Jason would always be the center of attention. As we got older, the favoritism became even more blatant. Jason's mistakes were always forgiven and forgotten, while mine were magnified. He dropped out of college after 2 semesters, wasting thousands of dollars in tuition, but my parents barely batted an eye. When I struggled to find a job after graduating, they constantly reminded me of how Jason was at least working hard at his latest get-rich-quick scheme, even though he was still living at home and borrowing money from them every other week. Jason's schemes ranged from selling fake designer clothes online to half-hearted attempts at starting a business that never made it past the planning phase. There was the time he tried to flip houses, convinced he'd be the next big real estate mogul, but that ended with him almost bankrupting my parents when one of his investments went south. Each time, my parents would swoop in, bailing him out and blaming everyone but Jason for his failures. Meanwhile, I was expected to be the responsible one, the one who didn't need help, who didn't make mistakes, and who never complained. Despite all the negativity, I was determined to carve out a different path for myself. I threw myself into my studies, spent countless hours working part-time jobs, and did everything I could to distance myself from my family's toxic influence. I graduated college with honors and managed to land a series of internships that eventually led me to a promising career in tech. I was driven by the desire to prove to myself that I was more than just the overlooked son, more than the scapegoat for my family's dysfunction. But even as I started to build my own life, my family's toxic grip was never far away. My parents would frequently call me, not to check in or see how I was doing, but to ask for favors, complain about their problems, or remind me of how well Jason was doing. My brother, always looking for an angle, would try to rope me into his latest schemes, promising that we could make it big if I just invested a little money or helped him out with a project. I learned early on to set boundaries, but it was a constant battle to keep them from dragging me back into their chaos. One particularly bad episode happened when Jason got into trouble with the law. He'd been caught driving under the influence, and my parents were frantic. They begged me to help pay for his legal fees, saying that he was just going through a tough time and that family should always stick together. I refused, knowing that this was just another in a long line of bad decisions Jason had made, but my refusal only fueled their resentment. They accused me of being selfish, of abandoning my family when they needed me most, and it hurt more than I cared to admit. The guilt trips were relentless. My mom would call me crying, saying she didn't understand how I could be so heartless, while my dad would drop passive-aggressive hints during family dinners about not turning your back on blood. They painted Jason as the victim of circumstances beyond his control, while I was cast as the cold, unfeeling son who wouldn't lift a finger to help. It was exhausting, and no matter how hard I tried to explain my side, they refused to listen. I was used to being the outsider in my own family, but the constant drama and manipulation wore me down. I knew I needed to keep my distance, but no matter how hard I tried, it always felt like I was getting sucked back into their toxic orbit. Every success I had was met with skepticism or downplayed, while every setback was seen as proof that I was the difficult one. But despite it all, I kept pushing forward, determined to build a life that was my own. After years of grinding away in low-paying tech jobs, working long hours, and dealing with the ups and downs of the industry, my hard work finally paid off. I landed a high-paying job at a top tech company, one of those dream opportunities that seemed almost too good to be true. The role was exactly what I'd been working toward, a senior developer position with a six-figure salary, incredible benefits, and the chance to work on cutting-edge projects that excited me. Getting this job felt like winning the lottery. I remember the day I got the call from the recruiter offering me the position. I was in my tiny apartment, sitting at my secondhand desk, and when I heard the words, "We'd like to offer you the job," I nearly dropped my phone. All the late nights, the sacrifices, the moments of doubt, it all felt worth it in that instant. I had finally made it to where I wanted to be, and for the first time in a long time, I felt genuinely proud of myself. The company was everything I'd hoped it would be. The office was sleek and modern, filled with talented people who were just as passionate about tech as I was. I was surrounded by colleagues who respected my skills and valued my input. I dove headfirst into my new role, eager to prove myself and make the most of this incredible opportunity. The work was challenging, but I loved every minute of it. I felt like I was finally doing something that mattered, and it was a welcome change from the constant criticism I'd grown up with. My new job wasn't just about the money or the title, it was about proving to myself that I could rise above my circumstances. I was working on projects that pushed the boundaries of technology, collaborating with some of the brightest minds in the industry, and finally feeling like I was part of something bigger than myself. I'd stay late at the office, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Every line of code, every brainstorming session, felt like a step closer to becoming the person I'd always wanted to be. For the first few months, everything was perfect. I was excelling at my job, meeting my deadlines, and even receiving praise from my manager for my innovative ideas. I was building something that was truly mine, a career that I was proud of and that I'd earned on my own terms. My salary allowed me to move into a nicer apartment, save money for the first time, and even start planning for the future. It felt like all the pieces of my life were finally falling into place. But while my professional life was thriving, my relationship with my family remained strained. My parents barely acknowledged my new job, offering only half-hearted congratulations when I told them the news. My brother, predictably, made a snide comment about how lucky I was and suggested that I must have known someone to land a position like that. It stung, but I tried not to let their negativity dampen my excitement. I was determined to focus on my own happiness, even if my family couldn't share in it. One weekend, I decided to visit my parents, hoping that maybe they'd finally take an interest in my success. I showed up at their house, armed with stories about my job and the cool projects I was working on, eager to share my accomplishments. But as usual, the conversation quickly turned back to Jason. He was in between jobs again, exploring new opportunities, as my mom put it, and they were more concerned about his struggles than celebrating my wins. I tried to steer the conversation back to my work, explaining the new technology one was developing and how it could change the industry, but my parents were distracted, only half listening. My dad nodded absently, and my mom, after a brief pause, said, "That's nice, Aiden. But have you talked to Jason lately? He's been feeling really down." I left their house feeling deflated, once again reminded that no matter what I did, it would never be enough to compete with Jason's constant need for attention. I was tired of always being second best, of having my achievements overshadowed by my brother's perpetual chaos. But I tried to push those feelings aside, focusing instead on the fact that, for once, I was building something that was mine. I confided in my friends, hoping they'd understand the mix of pride and frustration I was feeling. Most of them were supportive, cheering me on and encouraging me to keep my head up, but there was still that lingering sadness that my own family couldn't see my success for what it was. My best friend, Sarah, would often remind me that not everyone gets the family they deserve, and that I was doing great on my own. Her words were comforting, but they couldn't completely fill the void left by my parents' indifference. As my career continued to flourish, I started to notice a shift in my brother's behavior. Jason, who had always been dismissive of my work, suddenly seemed interested in what I was doing. He'd call me out of the blue, asking about my job, my salary, and the perks that came with it. At first, I thought he was just being nosy, but it quickly became clear that Jason wasn't just curious, he was jealous. He'd make offhand comments about how easy my job seemed compared to his past struggles and how lucky I was to have fallen into such a great position. I tried to ignore his remarks, knowing that they were rooted in his own insecurities, but it was hard not to feel the sting of his words. Jason had always been the one in the spotlight, the one my parents doted on, and I could sense that my success was threatening the carefully constructed narrative of our family. For the first time, I was the one who was thriving, and Jason couldn't stand it. It wasn't just Jason's attitude that changed, his actions became more insidious. He started showing up at my apartment unannounced, acting overly friendly while subtly undermining my achievements. He'd point out flaws in my apartment, make snide comments about my lifestyle, and constantly ask if I was sure I could handle such a demanding job. It was like he was waiting for me to fail, and his jealousy was seeping into every interaction. Things took a darker turn when Jason started spreading rumors about me. It started subtly, little digs he'd make when we were around friends or family, planting seeds of doubt about my job. He'd joke that I was barely working or that my company was probably just desperate when they hired me. I brushed it off as typical Jason behavior, but the more he talked, the more I realized that he was deliberately trying to undermine me. Then came the phone calls. One evening, I received a frantic call from my cousin, who worked in the same industry. She sounded concerned, asking if everything was okay at my job. Confused, I asked her what she meant, and that's when she dropped the bombshell. Jason had been telling people that I was in trouble at work, that I was on the verge of being fired for misconduct, and that I'd been slacking off ever since I got the position. I was stunned. None of it was true, of course, but the damage was done. Jason had been spreading these lies to anyone who would listen, painting me as someone who was undeserving of my success. He'd even gone as far as to tell some of my former colleagues, claiming that I was struggling and that my company was regretting their decision to hire me. It was all fabricated nonsense, but the rumors were starting to spread. I confronted Jason, furious that he would stoop so low. We met at a coffee shop, and I didn't waste any time getting to the point. "What the hell are you doing, Jason?" I demanded. "Why are you spreading lies about me?" Jason feigned innocence, but there was a smugness in his eyes that made my blood boil. "I'm just telling people what I heard," he said with a shrug. "Maybe you should work on your reputation, Aiden." His words were dripping with malice, and it was clear that he had no intention of stopping. I left the coffee shop feeling betrayed and helpless, knowing that Jason's lies were starting to gain traction. My family, of course, did nothing to intervene. When I told my parents what Jason had been saying, they brushed it off, suggesting that I was overreacting and that Jason was just going through a tough time. It was the same excuse they'd always used, and I was sick of it. The fallout from Jason's lies started to creep into every aspect of my life. Friends who'd once been supportive began to distance themselves, unsure of what to believe. I'd overhear whispered conversations at industry events, people speculating about my competence based on Jason's false stories. My professional reputation, something I'd worked so hard to build, was unraveling because of rumors I had no way of disproving. The rumors Jason had started were beginning to have real consequences. I noticed my colleagues acting differently around me, more guarded, less friendly. I'd catch them whispering in the break room or giving me sideways glances during meetings. At first, I chalked it up to paranoia, but then I started getting called into meetings with HR. They were routine check-ins, they said, but it was clear that my reputation was being questioned. One afternoon, my manager pulled me aside and asked if everything was okay. He mentioned that he'd heard some concerning things and wanted to make sure there wasn't anything I needed to address. I was mortified. Here I was, excelling at my job, meeting all my deadlines, and yet I was being treated like a liability. The rumors were spreading faster than I could contain them, and I felt powerless to stop it. The worst part was the feeling of helplessness. I knew I was doing everything right, I was hitting my targets, contributing valuable ideas, and consistently receiving positive feedback on my work. But none of that seemed to matter in the face of the gossip that was swirling around me. Every day, I'd walk into the office with a knot in my stomach, dreading what new accusation I'd have to defend myself against. Then, the unthinkable happened. I was called into a meeting with upper management, and it was clear from the moment I walked in that this wasn't just another check-in. They laid out a series of complaints they'd received, anonymous tips about my supposed unprofessional behavior, accusations of not meeting performance standards, and even claims that I was involved in unethical practices. It was all complete bullshit, and I knew exactly where it was coming from. I defended myself as best I could, explaining that the accusations were baseless and that someone was deliberately trying to sabotage me. But it was too late. The damage to my reputation had been done, and the company wasn't willing to take any chances. Despite my spotless track record, they decided to terminate my contract effective immediately, citing a breach of trust that they couldn't ignore. I walked out of that meeting in a daze, my dream job slipping through my fingers because of lies I had no control over. I felt humiliated, angry, and betrayed by the very people who were supposed to support me. Losing my job was a gut punch, but what hurt the most was knowing that my own family, my own brother, had been the one to orchestrate it all. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I was consumed by a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. How could Jason have done this to me? How could my own family have been the cause of my downfall? I replayed every interaction in my mind, wondering if there was something I could have done differently, some way I could have stopped the rumors before they got out of hand. But no matter how much I tortured myself with what-ifs, the reality remained the same. I was jobless, my reputation was in shambles, and I had no idea how to pick up the pieces. When I told my parents what had happened, they were shockingly indifferent. My mom sighed, saying that maybe it was for the best and that I should focus on fixing things with Jason. My dad barely looked up from his newspaper, offering nothing but a half-hearted, "I'm sorry to hear that." It was like they didn't even care that my life had just been turned upside down. I reached out to Jason one last time, desperate for some kind of explanation, but he just brushed me off. "You always think you're so much better than everyone else," he sneered. "Maybe this will teach you a lesson." I was left reeling, my career in ruins and my trust shattered. I'd worked so hard to build something of my own, and it had all been taken away because of my family's toxic games. I knew I couldn't stay in that place of anger and despair, but I had no idea how to move forward. Losing my job was a wake-up call. It forced me to confront the reality of my family's toxicity and how much I'd allowed their behavior to impact my life. I'd spent years trying to earn their approval, to prove that I was worthy of their love, but it was clear that nothing I did would ever be enough. I was done playing their games, done sacrificing my happiness to appease people who would never truly have my back. The first thing I did was cut off contact with Jason. I blocked his number, unfollowed him on social media, and made it clear to my parents that I wanted nothing to do with him. It was a difficult decision, but I knew that I couldn't keep letting him poison my life. My parents were upset, accusing me of being cruel and tearing the family apart, but I didn't care. For once, I was putting myself first. Next, I threw myself into finding a new job. It wasn't easy, my confidence had taken a huge hit, and the rumors had spread far enough that my reputation in the industry was tarnished. I applied to countless positions, but the rejections piled up, each one feeling like another blow to my already fragile self-esteem. I started to doubt myself, questioning whether I'd ever be able to rebuild what I'd lost. I took on odd jobs just to keep myself afloat, freelancing, tutoring coding classes online, anything that would pay the bills. It was humbling to go from a high-paying job with a bright future to piecing together gigs just to make ends meet. But each small success, no matter how insignificant it seemed, was a reminder that I was still capable. I was still valuable, even if my family couldn't see it. I reached out to old contacts, networked tirelessly, and even started working on freelance projects just to keep my skills sharp. Slowly but surely, I began to piece my life back together. It wasn't glamorous work, and it didn't pay nearly as well as my previous job, but it was something. Every small victory, a positive client review, a successful project, a new connection, felt like a step in the right direction. During this time, I also started seeing a therapist, something I'd resisted for years. I needed to unpack all the anger, betrayal, and resentment that had built up over the years. Therapy became my safe space, a place where I could finally let go of the weight I'd been carrying and start to heal. My therapist helped me see that I wasn't responsible for my family's actions, and that cutting them off didn't make me a bad person, it made me strong. One breakthrough session came when my therapist asked me a simple question: who are you without your family's expectations? It was something I'd never truly considered. I'd spent my whole life trying to meet standards that were impossible to reach, defined by people who didn't appreciate me. Now, I had the opportunity to redefine myself on my own terms. As the months went by, I began to rebuild not just my career, but my sense of self. I stopped measuring my worth by my family's approval and started focusing on what made me happy. I took up new hobbies, reconnected with old friends, and even started dating again. For the first time in a long time, I felt free from the constant judgment, the toxic comparisons, and the feeling of never being enough. One day, I received a call from a former colleague who had heard about what had happened. She told me about a job opening at her new company and encouraged me to apply. I was hesitant at first, worried that the rumors would follow me, but she assured me that my work spoke for itself. I went through the interview process with a mix of anxiety and hope, and to my amazement, I got the job. It wasn't as high-paying as my previous role, but it was a fresh start, a chance to prove myself without the shadow of my family's lies hanging over me. I poured everything I had into my new position, determined to make the most of this second chance. My new colleagues were supportive, my manager was encouraging, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. With my career back on track, I finally felt like I was gaining control over my life again. But as much as I tried to move on, the pain of what my family had done still lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal, and it was hard not to dwell on all the what-ifs. What if Jason hadn't spread those lies? What if my parents had stood up for me? What if I'd never lost that job? I realized that I needed closure, not just for what had happened, but for years of unresolved hurt. I decided to confront my parents one final time. I didn't expect an apology or a change of heart, but I needed to make it clear that their actions had consequences. I invited them to my apartment, hoping that a neutral setting would keep things civil. When they arrived, I could tell they were on edge. My mom launched into small talk, commenting on my apartment and asking about my new job, but I cut straight to the point. "I'm not here to play nice," I said, my voice firm. "I'm here because I need you to understand how much you've hurt me." My parents looked taken aback, but I continued, laying out everything I'd been holding in for years. I told them about how their favoritism, their constant excuses for Jason, and their refusal to acknowledge my accomplishments had chipped away at my confidence. I explained how Jason's lies had cost me my job, and how their indifference had made me feel completely alone. My mom tried to interrupt, to defend Jason, but I stopped her. "This isn't just about him," I said, my voice breaking. "It's about you. You've spent my entire life making me feel like I was never good enough, and I'm done with it." My dad, usually so passive, finally spoke up. He apologized, but it felt hollow, more of a formality than a genuine admission of guilt. My mom, meanwhile, teared up, insisting that they'd only ever wanted the best for me. But it was too little, too late. I could see that they still didn't fully grasp the impact of their actions, and I knew that I couldn't keep waiting for validation that would never come. I ended the conversation by setting boundaries. I told them that I needed space and that I wouldn't be coming around for a while. They were upset, but I didn't let their guilt trip sway me. This was about protecting myself, and I wasn't going to compromise on that anymore. As they left, I felt a sense of relief, as if a weight I'd been carrying my whole life had finally been lifted. I knew that my relationship with my parents would never be what I'd hoped, but I was done trying to fix what was broken. I was ready to move forward on my own terms. I leaned into the support of my friends, who became my chosen family. We celebrated my small wins, commiserated over the setbacks, and reminded me that I was more than the sum of my family's judgments. I started volunteering at a local community center, teaching coding to underprivileged kids who reminded me of myself when I was younger, eager, bright, and full of potential. It was a reminder that my worth wasn't defined by my family's approval or the job I'd lost. I had something to offer, and that was enough. Final update: reclaiming my life. Hey Reddit, it's Aiden again. It's been over a year since I lost my job because of my family's lies, and I wanted to share an update. I'm now working at a new company, surrounded by supportive colleagues and finally feeling like I'm back on track. My relationship with my family is still complicated, but I've set boundaries and I'm focusing on my own happiness. Jason and I haven't spoken since everything went down, and while it's hard, I know it's for the best. I've learned that sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who are closest to you, and it's okay to walk away from that. I'm also continuing therapy, and it's been a game changer for my mental health. I'm learning to let go of the anger and focus on rebuilding my self-worth. I've reconnected with old friends, taken up new hobbies, and even started volunteering at a local tech mentorship program to help others who are just starting out in the industry. Losing my job was one of the hardest things I've ever been through, but it taught me valuable lessons about resilience, self-respect, and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who genuinely care about you. I'm still rebuilding, but I'm no longer defined by my family's expectations or their lies. To anyone out there dealing with toxic family dynamics or feeling like you're constantly fighting an uphill battle, just know that you're not alone. It's okay to set boundaries, to cut ties when necessary, and to put yourself first. You deserve to be happy, and you deserve to succeed on your own terms. Thanks for reading, and here's to reclaiming our lives, one step at a time.